And we all also know that if a factory closes, for reasons that have nothing to do with the local area, probably because markets somewhere else in the world are being affected, or it's moving somewhere else in the world, if the factory closes, people are unemployed, they start to leave the region, other jobs disappear in the region because people are leaving. Schools have to close, hospitals have to close, businesses have to close because people are leaving. So when the population grows through immigration, immigrants too create jobs at the same time that they fill jobs. So that's one logical thing that it's important to keep in mind. The second important thing to keep in mind is that immigrants do work in very different sectors of the economy. Especially undocumented immigrants tend to work in different sectors of the economy. And the extent to which every job depends on immigrant labor. In the city of Lynn, next to where I live in Salem, there's one of the only industries left in Massachusetts, the only really big factories, like those old big factories from the 1940s and 1950s with a unionized workforce of 3,000 people, where families, generations of families have worked in that factory. The factory is like the soul of the city. It's a General Electric factory. Most of General Electric's factories have left the United States, just like the auto factories and the steel factories. But this factory is still there in Lynn. Almost everybody who works in the factory is white or black. There's almost no Latinos that work in the factory, in those unionized, good paid jobs that have benefits, that have vacations, that have retirement plans and health plans. But guess who cleans the factory at night when all those workers go home? They would not have their jobs if there wasn't a Latino workforce to underscore everything that they're doing. Who washes the dishes in the restaurants where those workers go after work, making those restaurants cheap enough for those workers to go to those restaurants? So that's another thing that's happening, that is complementary sectors of the economy are being worked in. And the third thing, and this is a much bigger abstract thing, and I'll just mention it quickly, but I think it is important to think about, that is, until about 100 years ago, or even less than 100 years ago, most of the labor that was performed on this planet was performed by force. People weren't competing over jobs. They were trying to avoid being forced to go work for somebody else. Most people survived on subsistence. It was the colonial system that destroyed subsistence, in part in order to force people into the labor force, to force them to compete for jobs. We could structure a non-subsistence economy, and now it's pretty much impossible to go back to a subsistence economy. Once that millennial tie of people to the land is broken, there's only a few crazies like Bob, who wants his garden, who actually want to go back to working the land. And I talk about this in the epilogue of the book, because a lot of my work is in Colombia among people who are peasant farmers, who do not want to be taken away from their land and forced into this proletarianized economy. And they are being forced. And their children are growing up in the slums on the edges of cities, and their children are never going to want to go back to the land the way their parents do. They're going to be fighting for those jobs. It doesn't have to be that way. That is, we can create, and we're moving more and more in that direction of forcing people to compete with each other for jobs. And one of the ways that we're doing that is by removing all of the social safety network that can cushion people if they work less. I know lots of people that if they could have free public higher education, if they could have a national health care system, if they could have a real national retirement plan, if they could have a way of caring for their elderly parents, if they could have a way of having their children in daycare, if they could do all of those things while working half-time, they would love to work half-time. So one of the best ways that we can try to reduce the competition for jobs is to try to raise the floor for everybody, so that people aren't competing for jobs in the same desperate way. Finally, one last thing that's also connected to this. Our level of consumption in this country, despite the economic crisis, is so grotesquely above both what anybody else in the world consumes and what the planet can stand, that we have to change that. And as long as we're trapped in the mindset, as Martin was saying, we get trapped in these mindsets and it's hard to think outside of them. But as long as we're trapped in the mindset that the only way that we can have a flourishing society is to keep producing more and keep consuming more and more, because that's the only way we can create jobs. And if we don't have jobs, we're all going to fall through the cracks and die. As long as we are in that mindset, we can't have a planet that's going to be here in 50 or 100 years. We have to break that mindset. We have to break this attachment to consumption and production for its own sake, just for the sake of jobs. So we really have to rethink everything about jobs. Beacon Press, they have a blog, and then in the comment section, somebody said that they thought that Beacon Press, which is who published my book, they're the publishers of the UU Church, based in Boston, that they should do a global search and replace. And everywhere that anything they ever published used the phrase standard of living, it should be replaced with level of consumption. Because we should be honest about what we mean. And we should redefine standard of living to mean something other than level of consumption. So we can look around, I bet we could, in 20 minutes, in this group of people, come up with what we thought was a decent standard of living. It would include health care. It would include retirement. It might not include a new iPod every year. So if you want to ask people to reduce their level of consumption, you're going to get a lot better response than if you want to ask people to reduce their standard of living. Because standard of living, if we don't define that and explain what it means, but I actually think that there's many ways that our standard of living, our quality of life would improve if we were able to lower our levels of consumption. And I think a really good example for looking at this is in transportation. How many of us wouldn't rather have a really good system of public transportation that was cheap, that we could rely on, that we could use to get where we wanted, that we could carry our children on, that we could use after we have disabilities that don't let us drive? How many of us wouldn't rather have that than be sitting in traffic jams every single day? So our quality of life could improve while our number of possessions decreased. The US Census has changed every single decade. They have changed the kinds of categories that they use to try to identify race in the United States. And I had an interesting experience trying to help some of my ESL students who are Guatemalan Mayan, very recent immigrants to the United States, to help them fill out the census form. And when we got to the question for, like, some of the questions I could actually help them with, like, you know, what's the zip code? Okay, there's an answer to that. I can tell you what it is. But when we got to the Hispanic origin question, they looked at me and said, "Are we Hispanic?" And I said, "Well, I can't tell you whether you're Hispanic or not. You have to decide whether you're Hispanic or not. I can tell you a little bit about the history of the category in the United States, but I can't tell you whether you're Hispanic or not. Nobody can tell you whether you're Hispanic or not. Only you can decide whether that term means something to you that you identify with or it doesn't." Then they got to the question of national origin, and there was a list of Latin American countries that they could be from. I think they decided to choose yes for Hispanic, so then there was the list of Latin American countries. Well, Guatemala wasn't on there, so they had to check other. Then they got to the race question, and they looked through all of the various racial categories, and there are a lot of racial categories now. And then one of them said, "Well, I don't see anything here that really applies to us, but maybe we should put Guam in, because that sounds kind of like Guatemala." So, I mean, the racial categories are crude attempts to approximate historical phenomena that have led people to have experiences that categorize them in different ways.